Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Marilyn Butler about Maria Edgeworth. As one of the novel's leading women, Erroljean was flanked by others. Glenthorne's first wife, his nurse, Eleanor, his second wife, Cecilia, and these, Eleanor, the nurse of much the most interesting and original creation, helped by a role that is maternal rather than sexual, as his mother in babyhood, Eleanor in Mother Ireland, Kathleen in Houlihan, stubborn and earthly, the most emotive and influential figure in the hero's life. The figurine of Irish identity was an old poor woman emerged in the course of the 18th century. It is now commonly argued because Ireland was indeed emasculated and generally disempowered at this time. But Edgeworth, a woman of writer, makes more of the stereotype. The presence of ennui of three symbolic women figuring Ireland complicates matters. So does the contrasting character between Geraldine, strong, witty, optimistic, and Eleanor, disappointed and regressive. Supposedly his former foster mother, but in fact his natural brother, Eleanor proves the real mistress of Glenthorne's destiny. She appears during his 25th birthday celebrations, just when he is riding out to kill himself. She both kills him in his English existence by causing a fatal accident and brings him to life as an Irishman and inducing him to return to Ireland. One of the means she employs of storytelling of the Irish past, always significantly stories of Irish rebelliousness against English rule, a fact that gives an added dimension that of plausibility to the subsequent association of her sons with the 1798 rebellion. But much later in the plot, she brings the hero's reign to an earl to an end, killing himself once more by revealing the true history of his birth, or rather infancy. Through the baby motif of some cosmic associations, its tragical potential is realized for Eleanor. The cultural differences between mother and son prevent them from understanding each other's wants. Each gives the other unwise material gifts that, as in a fairy tale, proves burdensome and alienating. Her distress when her son gives her up to a gift of the earldom kills Eleanor, and she dies without being reconciled to him. Cecilia, associated more prosaically with the Glenthorne estate to which she is heir, lacks the symbolic resonance of Eleanor and Geraldine, but her appearance in the plot just after Eleanor dies has a touch of uncanny about it. Both of them are all autochthonous creatures who represent the part of Ireland to which the hero's fate is tied. Since Cecilia enters only in the schematic closing chapters, neither her personality nor her world ever takes on the density of specification of the earlier chapters on the estate. The third and last of the hero's changes of identity from O'Donoghue to his wife's name of Delamere seem especially arbitrary. Edgeworth, in fact, seems to want to amuse experienced novel readers with an elaborate play on the celebrated end of one of the best regarded English novels, Frances Burney's Cecilia. There, the middle-class heroine, Cecilia Braverly, lost her fortune because her aristocratic fiancé, Mortimer Deville, would not be changed his name to hers, since to do so offended his pride in caste and of gentry. Berner's heroine is persuaded to give up her name and social identity and to become Cecilia Deville, rearranging the counters, reversing the outcome. Edgeworth has the shadowy Cecilia Delamere emerge at the final as the triumphant mediocrat who absorbs the dual personality representing feudalism, Glenthorne or Donoghue. This is the last of the hero's transformation, and the Irish humiliations already visited on him by Geraldine now appear complete. Even by Edgeworth's non-naturalistic standards, and the last 6 chapters of Ennui represent an extreme case, becomes a series of bizarre games of which the most flamboyant, the change at nurse, and also the most conscientiously and wittily narrated. Normally when his folk motif is used, some sign remains on the baby or the baby clothes, which allows him or her to be identified. Ennui jokes cheerfully at his usual way of handling the business. The child who should have become the end, the Earl, was not born with a birthmark, but was handed over, of course, to the drunken servant who dropped him on the fender at 3 days old. When Christie is persuaded to uncover his bald pate, He displays all sorts of signs, not merely the aristocratic through non-hereditary cicatrice on which the traditional plot depends, but the plebeian tents and lumps of the youth spent at fairs, fisting with the boys of Shrod na Scrob, an educationalist. Edgeworth followed Locke into the almost devout belief in the formative influence of acquired over innate characteristics, the contrasting character of true and false earls side in NUI with the environmental lobby by proving that earls are made and not born. Christie's skull is densely written over a phonologist model's head. Itself cancels the sign of the aristocratic beginnings. Meanwhile, Edgeworth's sly bestow on the doctor as none other than the real-life Sylvester O'Halloran, expert reader of Ireland's origins. The task of deciphering Glenthorne's skull, of which, of course, there is nothing either ancient or infantile to be found. NUI is far more conscientiously literary book than Castle Rackrent, and is always referring to other books. Why not then to the fairy tale of Eleanor Tells? The central character is no common landowner, but a hero who falls under a spell once an old woman in a red cloak enters his life as she lures him to Ireland, and she eventually waves her wand again, and he awakens from his trance to find himself playing Christio Donnogho, who's penniless and obscure, has to set out alone in the world to make his living. From the point the former Glenthorne doubles with sub-serial comic figures of the blacksmith Earl, who also undergoes a transitional temptation and trial as master of the enchanted castle, finds the Wonderland a nightmare and wakens with relief to resume his old work at the forge. The presence is so folkloric, a plot underlines the essential fictionality of the tale, which can offer only a resemblance of truth, but the role-playing and the role-swapping of the two foster brothers is eventually the truth of the tale, for it symbolizes their independence and equality. It becomes impossible to say which brother is more Irish, which more English, and which earns more credit for generosity or brotherliness. If they can both be seen to lose the Glenthorne estate, they can both be said to earn it. Each abdicates its owner of Glenthorne, the role of which made him unhappy, and each returns there to do a job of work he professionally trained to do. While this may contain a lesson about knowing your lot in life, it also contains one about the true value that inheres in labor. However real the scenes of Glenthorne, they may seem as a near documentary record of Irish life. NUI, containing fable of shape-shifting and magical transformations, warns us to keep our distance from the characters and what befalls them. Yet in this second Irish tale, as in the first, we can recognize the clear outlines of a great deal of documented family and neighborhood country, as if in Castle Rackrent, Edgeworth draws a family history and local gossip dating to the Main from times past. In NUI, she renders the years 1795 through 8 as a recognizable version of the scenes or letters we're recording month by month. This too is gossip and unidentifying, so of course, to many of her Irish readers, is not of the wider cosmopolitan readership. In 1797, R.L. Edgeworth fell out with the more zealous Protestant neighbors and fellow magistrates. In February 1796, he stood as a candidate in a local by-election and was defeated. In 1798, he and his family were forced to flee their home because the countryside around Edgeworth town, nowadays known by its Irish name Mastrum, was in the hands of Catholic rebels. When he took his family to the nearby Protestant town of Longford for refuge, R.L. Edgeworth was nearly lynched by a Protestant mob which suspected him of trying to steal, with his new invention, a telegraph to the French army camped dangerously close at hand. As these episodes figure in chapters such and such of NUI, they appear scrambled as though in code, and most interesting feature of the disguise is their apportionment between three characters, the brothers, Glenthorne, Christie, the blacksmith, and Odie. All three are suspected of sympathy with the rebellion, and each experiences violence or the threat of violence from one or the other group of extremists in the act of repressing her father's ostracism and time of danger, which, as most partisan daughter, Edgeworth herself found traumatic in real life. She separates him into a trio who straddle fantastically the Iro-Anglo-Irish divide. In her creative representation of the very emotive events, Edgeworth performs a similar imaginative self-divisions. The violent years that repeat themselves somewhat schematically in Ennui are probably the years in which the Condi sequence in Castle Rackrent was written. In letters written to her aunt and cousin at the time, she is reporting the family's social isolation anxiously and writing emotionally about her home as a place of refuge. Though Thaddy at the time is distanced and satirized character, in this part of the tale at least, he appears to speak his own strong emotional attachment to the enclosed world of the family and the estate. In sentiment, Ellamore can equally sound like the character of Ennui, closest to the tone and value system of her creator. In short, Edgeworth's real-life alliances are not being simply reproduced in the tales, where on the contrary, her self-positioning as a complex and unstable as a representation of the Anglo-Irish landlord hero, the imaginative terrain Edgeworth shapes in fiction after Castle Rackrent is generally a world of productive change and of social reconciliation for individuals, of remaking or empowerment. Her children's stories were often contrasted with fairy tales, unfavorably by Lamb, Coleridge, and eventually Scott because of their realistic settings. Actually, they share with many fairy tales the child's fantasy of becoming a free agent, temporarily escaping the grip of powerful adults. Her novels and tales for adults, so practical and well documented, well informed and worldly wise, do not strike the reader at first sight as fantasies. Yet Ennui is one that repeats insistently that we must adopt the way of reading. The revolution of Irish have just failed to achieve is offered them in fantasy, and Edgeworth's drastically restyled version of social transformation. They are imagined getting their seat at the international dining table. Health, wealth, and the pursuit of happiness lies immediately before them. The real world of the immediate past has turned turtle in this very special country, which appears to be in the grip of a trio of larger-than-life, faintly supernatural women capable of making anything happen. Edgeworth is everywhere a strong resistor of stereotyping, and all her tales are individualized women who are often unusually energetic and articulate. The Edgeworth heroine has always been thought of as notably well-educated and rational, that is less feminine than other writers' heroines, just as characteristically, her older women are dominant, even domineering. Lady Delacour in Belinda, Lady Devant in Helen, and Miss Beaumont in maneuvering tales of fashionable life. On the face of it, the women characters of her Irish tales, especially Castle Rackrent, are simply less salient, even if Lady Geraldine, Lady Ormond of the Absentee, and Miss Annalie of Ormond have at least an honorific place among Edgeworth's women of power, but her Irish women really deserve a special attention as the group because they have a part in the narrative itself more significantly political than the tale set in England, and because their symbolic roles, again a feature unique to her writing on Ireland, have to do directly or implicitly with the national consciousness. Women's characters could seldom be given such resonant roles in the domestic novel. In fact, it is probably no accident that women writers such as Edgeworth, Hamilton, Owenson, Porter, and Ferrier authored the first handful of national tales in the early 1800s. The imagined community and the empowered women tend to appear in the symbiotic relations, each needing the other as a condition of existence. In both The Absentee and Ormond, some leading women characters are more solidly drawn. This is more naturalistic, more psychologically, and in their social circumstances than the women of the first two Irish tales. The Absentee scores at once with an alienated Irish social climber, Lady Clonbrony, the clever, plain, and equally alienated English heiress, Mrs. Broadhurst, and the gallery of cosmic types from Lady Seanbrony's thankless guest to the hapless Irish hostess, Mrs. Rafferty. Yet in its heroine, Grace Nugent, The Absentee repeats the essentially allegorical notion of characterization used in Ennui. Grace's name is the title of an Irish popular air. In real life, the Nugents were leading Catholic gentry of the Irish Midlands, known for their principled attachment to their religion and their service in European Catholic armies. The nation of Grace's mother, Mrs. St. Omer, evokes the French Catholic seminary in which Irish boys were commonly trained for their priesthood before the establishment of Maynooth in 1795. The answer to who she must be, a representative of the well-born, dispossessed Catholic gentry of Ireland. What happens to Grace Nugent is somewhat odder, and it is again an echo of the plotting of Ennui. She has a shadowy namesake and double, a pleasant girl, also Grace, who seems to exist in order to make the heroine a rather than an individual. As a character, she seems to have no trait of her own except a desire to return to Clonbrony and to take the absentee family of that name back to the island with her. As the closing stages of the plot are held up for an examination, not so much of Grace's own moral character as that of her mother, long considering not to have been legally married to her father, an English officer in the Foreign Army. The decoding of this mystery again requires the service of a character based on the real-life Irish Catholic historian Sylvester O'Halloran. By proving the purity of Grace and Grace's female line, the Count O'Halloran of the tale again repeats the scholarly achievement of Dr. O'Halloran of real life. He proves the legitimacy and innate nobility of Catholic Ireland and prepares the way for the reconciliation of the Anglo-Irish Protestant gentry. Edgeworth's allegorical Irish women are a particular strange variant of the insufficiently discussed type. The figure of the woman as a symbolically national figure, as she figures in the writing of some other women novelists from the late 18th century, by virtue of her articulary, her involvement in politics, and her influence on events. This embodiment of women's social frustrations is a quite different figure from the peasant girl of Marianne and used into the emblem of revolution by French male artists in the 1790s, and more saliently in 1830. Edgeworth began Ennui before the appearance of two novels which resemble it by writers which she countered rivals. Lady Morgan, The Wild Irish Girl, 1806, which has an Irish-speaking patriot heroine, and Germaine St. Stales, Corinne, whose heroine is in effect an Italian nationalist agitator. Ennui and the Absentee virtually coincided with two more nationalist novels from Lady Morgan, a woman-centered political fantasy, Ada of Athens, and a striking novel featuring a Hindu priestess and set in India. The missionary in both Morgan's Oriental novels, a woman's tale traveler seduces and also contends with a woman who is by birth a social leader and a recognized focus of national consciousness. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, has only an incidental place in this sequence, but her historical novel of ideas, Valperga, is important to it. One of its two leading women, one Beatrice, represents later medieval religious faith, and the other, the Countess of Valperga, the same period emerging secular idealism and its political expression, republicanism. Book is named then after a city-state, but the name does double duty as the title of the woman George Eliot's heroine Romola, who has much in common with the Countess of Valperga, is now the best known of the line of empowered but tragic figures. The late 18th century trope of the nation as a woman does not enjoy a good press in modern times. Assumed to be typically a feature of men's writings, it is thought to reflect the low esteem in which both women and lesser, that is, defeated nations are held. Even if pursued that women authors are attracted to the device, modern feminists may well opine that they had no real right to bolster the dignity of an imagined heroine at the expense of her imagined subjects. The practice of the woman's novelist to imagine such a heroine generally sees it that her authority as a short-lived and problematic as Glenthorne's reign as Earl, the power of an Ida, Corinne of Romola, remains notional, even slippery, and it is not known being actively maintained through money, political intrigue, or the shredding of soldiers' blood. The male head of the state would have inherited power or wealth unopposed, and woman often find herself robbed of greatness by the men she trusts, most painfully by an unscrupulous lover, Shelley's Castrucci, Eliot's Tito, far from simply allowing a woman protagonist to act out cliches from the early 19th century masculine historical or colonialist yarn. The woman's version identifies with politicking in the wars of particular male pursuits and holds them up to scrutiny. Both the political concept, might is right, and the ideal of masculinity emerge undercut from the series of fictions, and here Ennui, a naturalized representative of the genre, seems quite typical of it, since the tripartite figure of Mother Island, Eleanor, Geraldine, Cecilia, lacks power in herself and yet morally masters the unmanly leading man, Glenthorne or Donnogho. In current feminist work and autobiography, it is often observed that women writers generally seem to have experienced difficulty in using the first person. Edgeworth's fondness of male narrators and her tendency to divide herself among diverse characters, male and female, illustrates this penchant for invisibility nowhere more than in Castle Rackrent, the best sustained of masquerades. Little has been written about Castle Rackrent's feminist implications, and not much about its women, with the limitations except of Sir Kit's Incarcerated Bride, the first of the 19th century novels, Madwoman in the Attic, the victimized Jewish Lady Rackrent, and a female Babylonian captive with a monstrously masculine society in which no least of all her Irish servants show her any mercy, but in her enforced passivity and silence, the Jewish and untypical of Rackrent women, Sir Murdoch's lady is a better litigant than Sir Murdoch and a better extortioner from the tenants. When she survives her husband, the first of the Rackrent lines of wives to do so, she drives away the most of the capital realized from their joint regime. In due course, Thady sees off both Sir Kit's wife and Sir Condy's, each in a depleted condition, each clutching what she has been able to salvage of her husband's money and her own. None of these consorts shares Thady's uncritical admiration of her husband and for their estate. The last of them, Sir Condy's cast-off mistress, Judy McQuirk, speaks of all the Rackrent women with alternative dynasty, which until now has lacked a spokesperson. And when Judy came up that evening and brought the childer to see his honor, he gives them all around guineas apiece. Hold up your head, says my sister to Judy, for who knows, but we may live to see you yet at the head of the Castle Rackrent estate. Maybe so, she says, but not the way you are thinking of. Sure, you wouldn't refuse to be my Lady Rackrent, Judy, if you had the offer, says I. But if I could do better, says she. What, she signifies it to be my Lady Rackrent and no castle? Sure, what good is the car and no horse to draw it? Shrewd and tough Judy makes it to take the best option that offer for herself and her children. She adjusts to the future and the future of delivering Thady's agonized and upwardly mobile son, Jason Quirk. The 3-day dialogue between Thady, his elderly sister, and his granddaughter, Judy, is one of the longest reported conversations in the book, and is the only one in which Thady encounters a direct refutation and counter review that he is puzzled how to answer. I was never so put to it in my life between these women's, so I said not a word more. Edgeworth's heart may incline in this conversation as so often to Thady, but her head equally surely goes with Judy, the peasant woman with a past whose only miscalculation now is to overrate her chances with her cousin Jason. Judy gets the general point right, and the 19th century is coming in with or without her, and its toughness and unobviousness, its feelings for the community, its recognition of the people and communities contend that open-ended last conversation of the best answer to the question, why read Edgeworth's Irish Tales? Marilyn Butler, King's College, Cambridge. Okay, so I know you're bored by now. I'm just going to read a couple more pages here. That's going to end our lesson with Mrs. Butler. Note on the text. The texts of Castle Rackrent and Ennui are reprinted from the collected tales and novels of Maria Edgeworth. 18 volumes, London, Baldwin and Craddock, 1832. A 14-volume collected edition of Tales and Miscellaneous Pieces appeared in 1825, in which misprints were only corrected, and not all of these. Maria Edgeworth was invited to correct the 1832 edition, and she did so, with the result of some tenacious errors were weeded out and some alterations made, of all them minor. The other difference between 1832 and any other edition of Edgeworth fiction is what makes a switch to more modern punctuation conventions, Above all, in quotation marks rather than dashes for dialogue, by the late 18th century, the punctuation of novels, relatively a mass medium, has become essentially standardized, leaving little, if anything, to the discretion of the individual writer. It seems fair in the circumstances to offer modern readers not the now archaic looking format in the generation earlier, but a text that still looks familiar and natural. As text for editing, Castle Rackrent and Ennui represent a marked contrast. Both books took some years to evolve, but Edgeworth reported that she wrote down the final version of Castle Wreck went quickly and easily. There was literary, not a correction, not an alteration, not in the first writing, no copy, as I recollect, no interlineation. It went to the press just as it was written. One result seems to have been that Edgeworth's later standard, Castle Rackrent, published in January 1800 by Joseph Johnson, contains more than its share of inconsistencies and rough passages, which afterwards needs tidying up. The early afterthought, the glossary that done in time to appear in the first edition, a further list of penciled corrections seemed to have made an earlier in the Edgeworth Town copy, but most of these were not implemented. A plan by R.L. Edgeworth to add another generation to the family, or the fifth edition of the 1810, met with successful resistance from his daughter, material which could not be used for the purpose, in fact, became the absentee. Ennui, which appeared in 1809 as the first of the Tales of Fashionable Life, first series was substantially worked on and perhaps drafted as early as 1804, but further revised and added to in 1806 and 7. A notebook containing anecdotes and plot motifs for Ennui seemed to have been in use for the latter of those dates. By then, Edgeworth, a successful author, seems to have been particularly anxious to maintain a reputation for polish and elegance. The text has been carefully worked over, and on a whole, it has few misprints, though some appear in some many quotations from French and Italian. Its most interesting variant is the footnote added in the fourth edition of 1813, which give readers anecdotes after traveling in Ireland. Here in all Edgeworth glossaries and appendices, there are some blurring and normal boundaries between fact and fiction, or what conventionally is the author's and what is the reader's. That's the end of Mrs. Butler's lesson on Maria Edgeworth. I think we might start talking about another author soon. I might go back to Poe, or I might go to Shelley, or I might even go to someone else. Maybe we'll go back to Poe since they dropped the Epstein list. Have a nice day.